Welcome to the E.D. Nixon Institute for Research and Cultural Enrichment series. The E.D. Nixon series is made possible by the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, in keeping with its mission to research and preserve African American history and culture, to serve as a living museum and civil rights clearinghouse, to teach and empower future generations. E.D. Nixon is one of the most noted civil rights activists in Montgomery, Alabama, before the arrival of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. E.D. Nixon was the president of the local and state branches of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the 1940s. Nixon was widely known for his untiring efforts to intervene on the behalf of Rosa Parks, which sparked the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott by posting her bail after she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery city bus. He was instrumental in securing funds for the Montgomery Improvement Association to protest the treatment of Blacks on city buses. The E.D. Nixon Research and Cultural Enrichment series presents on a wide range of topics, dealing with individuals, events, and periods in Montgomery, Alabama's African American history, which have not received full scrutiny by researchers. To stay abreast of our activities, follow us on Facebook at Civil Rights Center and check out our webpage, lib.alasu.edu/NATCNTR.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Howard Robinson. I'll serve as your Master of Order today. The National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, in cooperation with the Harper Council Trenum Senior branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, presents the first program in the National Center's E.D. Nixon Research and Cultural Enrichment series for 2021. The theme of this year's E.D. Nixon series is The Scaffold Sways the Future, African American Issues and Events Influencing the Nation's Democratic Principles. The theme for today's program is Antebellum Slavery in Alabama and the National Slavery Ferment. Our program will begin with greetings from Dr. Kennedy Wakesa, Associate Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs, after which Dr. Dorothy Autry will bring the occasion. Dr. Wakesa.
Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of our Board of Trustees, our President, Dr. Quinton T. Ross, and our Provost, Dr. Carl Perez. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dean Franklin and her team for organizing this timely event. This event will discuss African American issues and events in influencing the African American democratic issues, and also discuss antebellum slavery in Alabama and the national slavery ferment. I am looking forward to a very stimulating discussion, and I hope that everyone does too. Thank you.
Series, brainchild of Mr. Charles Vonner, ASU alumnus, longtime ASU staff member, and former member of the National Center's Steering Committee. For many years, Mr. Vonner carried out what was an annual event, presenting new evidence, bringing to light information on topics concerning African American history in Montgomery and at Alabama State University. One of these programs, for example, dealt with Black doctors who integrated Montgomery's white hospitals. Following Mr. Vonner's retirement from the National Center, the E.D. Nixon series became 2 to 3 hour-long programs each year, still reflecting Mr. Vonner's vision. The new E.D. Nixon series revolved around a yearly theme. This year's theme takes hold of a fact often overlooked in the narrative of America's transition from a fragile republic and to the nation often regarded as best reflecting egalitarian concepts. This fact is that African American issues and events have been essential to any claim the United States might make as a leader among nations exhibiting true democracy. Today, our guest scholars will discuss how slavery in Alabama figured in the broader story of issues which forced the nation to re-examine its democratic values, albeit during a very divisive and devastating civil war.
Thank you, Dr. Autry, for that occasion. Our program will feature two distinguished local scholars discussing today's theme. Dr. Dallas Hambury, Montgomery County archivist, will examine the African-American slavery in Montgomery County within the context of human bondage across the American South. Dr. Burtis English, professor of history at Alabama State University and president of the Harper Council Trentham Senior branch of the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History, will analyze the debate in Alabama concerning whether the state should withdraw from the Union over the issue of slavery, and he will address the pre-Civil War controversy within Southern state legislators and among whites in the 15 slaveholding states. A question and answer segment will take place following their discussion. Let's welcome Dr. Dallas Hambury.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Robinson, to speak today. Today I was particularly intrigued by the purpose of the program, which is to show how African Americans have been at the center of issues forcing the nation to return to its founding principles. And I think that when you look at the broader context, one could argue that, in fact, slavery was at the core of this nation's founding principles, particularly when you look at things such as the Three-Fifths Compromise of the Constitutional Convention, as well as the 20-year ban on discussing the banning of the international slave trade. And certainly when you expand beyond the Constitutional Convention and examine historical events such as the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that argument is further reinforced. In the Southeast, in Montgomery County in particular, local legal records demonstrate this as well. An entire legal apparatus is constructed across the Southeast, from chancery courts to probate courts, which I'll focus on today, are constructed to facilitate the machinery of slavery, indicating that at least in the Southeastern United States, the enslavement of African-American individuals is central to at least that part of the country's founding principles. So for the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on some key documents that can be found across the Southeast, including in Montgomery County, that support this argument. And I also want to delve into how useful these records are for understanding how slavery manifests itself in particular communities, as well as how these records can be used for African-American genealogical purposes prior to 1865, which, as we all probably know, can be often difficult because of the enslaved status of African-Americans. So let's begin with slaveholder affidavits. So as all of you probably know, enslaved individuals under Southern law were regarded as property. However, when it came to matters of criminal matters, enslaved people could also be regarded as people, which frankly is a stunning fact that enslaved people were regarded as both property and person under Southern law. That being said, because enslaved people could be regarded as persons under criminal law, they could be jailed. And at least in Montgomery County, as well as other Alabama Black Belt counties, we know for sure, in order to collect an enslaved person out of jail, they had to come to probate court and fill out what is deemed a slaveholder's affidavit, if you will. And these records are very significant for a number of reasons. Primarily, though, because they contain a whole host of demographic data about enslaved people, literally telling us what slavery looks like in these communities. These affidavits contain the name, age, sex, skin color of the imprisoned enslaved individual, as well as where their owner resided and their reason for imprisonment. In the Montgomery County slaveholder affidavits that we have, the reason given for imprisonment is running away. Of course, the affidavit is dated, and oftentimes owners would not come themselves to fill out the form in probate court. They would send a representative. And so if that was the case, the representative would put their name on the affidavit. And this is what the affidavits in Montgomery County look like. So you can see this is about an enslaved woman named Eliza, who's 36 years old, described as having black skin. Her owner was actually from Pike County, Alabama. And about 50% of our slaveholder affidavits in Montgomery County, the owners do not reside in Montgomery County, and in fact reside across Alabama's Black Belt. The other thing that stands out to me as a scholar is that when you see a form helps support a function, right? And in Montgomery County, the probate court is so often dealing with imprisoned enslaved individuals that they felt the need to go to a professional printer, have a form designed, and professionally printed. The contextual information that provides is immense. It demonstrates how much of an essential piece of the machinery local courts in Alabama, in particular probate courts, are in supporting slavery. The next record I want to focus on is our slaveback mortgages. A common foundational legal record, not just across the Southeast, but the nation, right up there with wills, estates, mortgage deeds, right? These are foundational legal records. And yet in my daily practice as county archivist, rarely do I see academic scholars or genealogists utilizing these very, very valuable records for understanding how slavery manifests itself in local communities and using them for African-American genealogical research. So as you can see, these records you would pass these records over if you didn't know what you were looking at. These frankly look like boring 19th century cursive handwritten pages, which they are. But upon closer inspection, these documents, like the one you see, are spelling out the legal terms of loans and mortgages across the Southeast. And not only that, they're providing data about enslaved individuals who are being used as collateral on loans across the region. In this particular example, it is naming the enslaved individuals as well as providing their ages, providing a host of information about enslaved people. These records are obviously valuable for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it gives us an understanding of the financial landscape of the antebellum South. And for those conducting genealogy, it also helps to establish a beachhead, locating an individual in the historical record. And from there, you can begin to trace that person through time, because what you'll frequently see in these records is that the same group of enslaved individuals are mortgaged again and again and again, enabling you to trace them through the historical record. Bonnie Martin has done some amazing work on the use of enslaved people as collateral in the Southeast, and I urge you to check out her scholarship on that. And she argues, and certainly in the Southeast and in Alabama, the primary sources bear this out, that slave-backed mortgages were a common feature of raising capital and credit in the Southeast, in some cases more so than banks. Obviously, they enabled those involved in the slave trade, from planters to traders, to raise capital in a region where hard currency is rarely available. And it also speaks to the essential evil nature of slavery, in that not only is an enslaved person being worked once in the field, but they're being worked twice as a financial instrument. We could find countless examples of this in Montgomery County and certainly across the Southeast. Again, speaking to the essential nature of slavery, at least to this portion of the country, right? In Montgomery County, George Hales would be a prime example of that. So if the average slave owner owned 10 or less slaves, George Hales was at the other end of the spectrum, owning almost nearly 100 individuals. Hales was a frequent user of slave-backed mortgages. We know of at least 7 loans between 1840 and the mid-1850s in which he uses enslaved people and land as collateral. I don't have an inflation calculator handy, but suffice it to say, these are significant sums, as you can see from the screen, particularly the August 13th, 1851 dated mortgage, in which he mortgages nearly half of the enslaved individuals he owns, and 760 acres for a massive sum of $16,300. The next record I want to focus on are estate files. Also a foundational legal document across the region, or across the nation, but essential for understanding how slavery manifests itself in local communities. Estate files contain a range of documents, as you'll see, that are highly informative, not just for understanding the centrality of slavery to the region, but also for conducting African-American genealogy. An example, case in point, would be the estate of Alexander Carter. As you can see from the data, who was also like Abel Haggerty in terms of his the size of his participation in the business of slavery. Upon his death, owning nearly 1,800 acres and 70 enslaved people in East Montgomery County. So for those of you that don't know what an estate file is, when a person passes away, their debts need to be settled and their assets need to be divided amongst their heirs, which is what's happening in Alexander Carter's case. As you can see from the screen, he dies a wealthy man with his estate valued at just under $1,800 in contemporary currency. What's telling about this and the nature of the centrality of slavery to the region is the amount of his estate that's bound up in the bodies of enslaved individuals. Just over 72% of his estate was not in cotton, was not in land, but in enslaved bodies. And I think that's telling. Certainly, we know that on the eve of the Civil War, the value of enslaved individuals was more than all the nation's railroads and factories combined. Lending credence to the argument that while cotton and land was a big business, human trafficking was at best was a close second. And so estate files contain a whole host of documents. So what you're seeing on the screen now is a hiring out document from Abel Haggerty's estate, whom we just spoke about. In the left-hand column, you'll see a list of enslaved individuals. And the second to left column are the names of those who leased the enslaved individuals. And then in the last column, you'll see the sums for which the enslaved individuals were leased. From one document, look how much information we're gleaning. This document also contains family structure of enslaved individuals. You'll notice that there are women's names, for example, Jane plus infant, Lucy plus infant. And you also notice the squiggly lines by some of the enslaved individuals. I believe that's referring to family structure because you'll notice in addition to women and their infant children, you also see the names of males, for example, Ephraim and Peggy near the top of the document. So from this one document, you're gaining a ton of information. And when you consider the enormity of slavery in the Southeast, this scenario was played out again and again and again across, if not thousands, hundreds of thousands of estate files, and they're not being utilized by researchers, not at all or not nearly enough. Another document that you'll find in estate files are unpaid doctor's bills, right? Because they're claims on the estate. Another highly informative type of document that you're going to find across the region. In this example, not only are the amounts of the unpaid doctor bills evident on the document, but also the names of the enslaved individuals as well as the medical conditions, illustrating how we can use estate files to begin to understand what does public health look like for enslaved individuals during the antebellum era? What effect does slavery have upon the minds and bodies of enslaved people? In this case, this document is covering conditions from pneumonia to, in the left-hand column, an abortion. So again, highly informative document. Mental health is also, obviously medical science in the mid-19th century is, what's the word to describe it? Pretty in its infancy, right? And that applies to medical or mental conditions as well. But 19th century antebellum estate documents do make mention of the mental health of enslaved individuals, as you can see from this document. Near the bottom of the document, you'll see an enslaved individual named Joe with a description beside his name reading subject to fits, which is essentially a 19th century diagnosis of mental health condition. In Joe's case, the condition was so severe that he was valued at $0. But the point is that you can use estate files to go far beyond what, say, the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules provide related to the health of enslaved individuals. Yet again, a local government record prevalent across the Southeast that's not being utilized enough. Perhaps the most common document that you'll find in estate files are inventories of enslaved people. And so what you see on the screen is a basic example of that, simply containing the name of the enslaved, and how much they were appraised at. More detailed inventories will often contain the ages of the enslaved, as well as medical conditions that might detract from their worth, and sometimes will contain descriptions of occupations as well, particularly if it's in a skilled profession like carpentry, blacksmithing, so on and so forth. I think the value of these sorts of documents are self-evident. Again, giving us at least a qualitative example of what slavery looks like in countless communities across the Southeast, and of course, again, providing a place to start with conducting pre-Civil War African-American genealogy. Some lesser known records that you'll find in county courthouses across the Southeast are courthouse auctions. Here in Montgomery County, you can find these in our real property records right in there with the deeds and the mortgages. In many cases, you'll see the auctioning of children in these records. And if that isn't horrific enough, look at the second data point, for example, where R.D. Gale in Clark County purchased a 4-year-old for $173. You may be wondering, how much work can a 4-year-old really do? Research has shown that, in fact, the owners of enslaved children could obtain mortgages on those children for their expected value at maturity. So in other words, individuals like R.D. Gale would speculate and purchase children and then, pocket the difference from the mortgage that they obtained on them. Again, these records are hidden away in courthouses across the region.
You have about 30 seconds.
So let me skip a few slides in, and we'll kind of cut to the end. Lastly, I want to speak about African-American marriage records. The intrinsic value of these records is beyond measure, representing, perhaps the first decision that formerly enslaved individuals were able to exercise after freedom. So again, a common record across the Southeast that can be used to understand how African Americans made that transition from slavery to freedom. And with that, I'll end it there. And are we taking questions after Dr. Burtis's presentation or right now?
Yes, we'll take some questions after Dr. English's presentation. I want to thank you for providing information about these valuable records, and ideally, during the question and answer process, we'll have an opportunity for you maybe to address some of the things that you didn't get to address in your presentation, and the stronger connection between these records and events in Montgomery and national issues. As slavery was playing out on the national level, how do these records reflect, some of the issues playing out at the national level?
Certainly.
In the meantime, let's invite now Dr. Burtis English to our discussion. Dr. English will evaluate Alabama's move towards secession within the context of the larger secession movement taking place throughout the slaveholding South. Dr. English.
Thank you, Howard, and of course, Dallas, for an extremely important talk. And thank you, Director Franklin and the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, an organization that I just absolutely love. So, you can't tell by my smiles that I love the individuals there and the organization itself, but believe it or not, I do. So this is a very timely discussion. I think not simply race-based slavery in Alabama, across the South, and indeed the country, but also the means by which many of these states came to divorce the Union. Persons, I'm quite confident, are familiar with some recent discussions that have rather happened and that continue to happen regarding certain places wanting to essentially replicate that act and leave the country yet again for what I argue are some of the same reasons. In any event, we can perhaps flesh out those ideas during our question and answer session. So let's kind of dive into what happened from late 1860 through midway of 1861. But after 1 p.m., December 20, 1860, South Carolina lawmakers passed unanimously what they wrote to be an ordinance to dissolve the union between the state they represented and other states united under her, meaning the country, compact titled the Constitution of the United States of America. The ordinance spelled out 3 significant reasons for the secession of not only South Carolina, but also the 10 additional Southern states that joined formerly South Carolina to form the Confederate States. One reason, state rights, was a carryover from the European colonial period and the Articles of Confederation attempt at an independent government. Sectionalism and nullification are two more reasons. A fourth reason, ethnic slavery, trumps all three aforementioned reasons for Southern secession: the formation of the Confederacy and the subsequent Civil War that resulted in approximately 620,000 human deaths. 620,000. So for decades following the war, numerous traditional white scholars, buffs, former Confederate supporters challenged the fact that preserving slavery was the principal cause of secession. According to those individuals, slavery was only one important factor that motivated Southern lawmakers to renounce the United States of America and to form a newer American nation. And the Confederacy truly was a nation. It was not a country. Those states were aligned completely with the principal desire of the lawmakers, which was to preserve slavery. All the same, other factors included, besides that, is states' rights, which I've already mentioned, sectionalism, mentioned, nullification, likewise mentioned. Those other factors, protective tariffs, divergent regional cultures, primarily the North versus the South or the South versus the North, free trade, and one that has not gone, I think, explored as perhaps fully as it could, ostensibly incompetent lawmakers. So those and countless other issues were peripheral. Slavery was the primary reason for Southern secession and hence the Civil War. Longtime Alabamian Democrat William Lowndes Yancey, is in Lowndes County, was at the forefront of secession agitation. Writing to a group of politicians from Georgia, his native state, December 14, 1860, 6 days before South Carolina lawmakers laid the Confederate cornerstone, Yancey predicted that Alabama, not South Carolina, would be the first state to leave the Union. Yet another idea we can revisit during the question and answer session of the program. Confident that no compromise or constitutional amendment would convince fellow Alabama officials to remain loyal to the Union, Yancey proclaimed that Northern officials' unwillingness to enforce the federal fugitive slave law, the federal fugitive slave law, among other pro-slavery measures, was the principal cause of Southern secession. If Northern officials continued to thwart federal law by enacting personal liberty laws, which were state laws, Federal Fugitive Protection Act, but state personal liberty law, support the federal law, oppose the state right law. Anyway, if federal lawmakers continue to do that, Alabama, Yancey said, would initiate the formation of a new American nation grounded in human slavery. According to him, and at the time, William Lowndes Yancey was leader of the so-called fire eaters, these ultra secessionist individuals who wanted states to secede regardless of whether other states joined or not. But he also was the leader of an organization called the League of United Southerners, which was based in Montgomery, Alabama. Yancey, as leader of both of those organizations, and again, a longtime Democrat, secessionist, a firebrand in Alabama, said there was nothing that anyone could say or do to change his mind about secession unless those Northern lawmakers reverse pivot. So on December 15, 1860, one day after Yancey made his proclamation, Alabama lawyers and politicians James Bailey and William Brooks, these were two lawmakers from Perry County, Alabama, where the governor of Alabama, Andrew B. Moore Sr., also resided, Black Belt territory, deeply enslaved populations. So Bailey and Brooks supported essentially Yancey's claims about slavery, Northern anti-slavers, and Southern secession. They too favored immediate secession. And according to them, at least 100 white Methodist preachers agreed with them. Now, of course, we can expand that number among Baptists and other denominationalists, but Baptists in particular, because they had broke with the regional and the national denomination over slavery. But that's a discussion for another day. Alabama Bailey and Brooks furthermore said needed to secede again, even if no other state joined in secession. Brooks and Bailey were straightforward about their beliefs. No respectable white Southerner would ever submit to what they referred to as Black Republican rule or support a government whose officials would place white people and non-white people on an equal constitutional footing. Nathaniel Dawson, a wealthy Alabamian planter, as well as an in-law of United States President-elect Abraham Lincoln, went one step further than Brooks and Bailey regarding slavery and freedom in the South. Linking the liberty of white people in the region to the bondage of its Black and bi-ethnic populations, Dawson asked how free white Southerners could be without slavery. He contended that the white Southerners with whom he associated, would rather die 1,000 deaths than to recognize a president, even a relative, who would threaten the existence of slavery. Dawson's contention about Lincoln wishing to end slavery was nonsensical. As a presidential candidate in 1860, Lincoln said he neither could nor wished to interfere with slavery where it existed legally. Politics largely colored his stance. His Republican associates carried the House of Representatives in 1858 and elected the House Speaker in 1859. Much confusion with that House Speaker election, but Republicans succeeded nonetheless. But they were not in sufficient number to control the House. Republicans lacked a 3/4 majority. So those who wished to abolish slavery could not have achieved that goal through legislative processes unless they won over numerous Democrats, including several Democrats representing Southern states, which was unlikely. To make matters worse for anti-slavery Republicans in Congress, Democrats comprised the majority in the Senate. Lincoln's predecessor, James Buchanan, was a Democrat, and Lincoln himself was concerned primarily about the expansion of slavery into the Western territories the United States government acquired via the American-Mexican, not Mexican-American, War. Again, he was not attempting to abolish slavery. The 1860 Republican platform did not seek to do that. And once inaugurated, Lincoln actually supported a proposed 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that, if ratified, would have perpetuated slavery where it existed legally. Now, for our good students in particular who are listening, we're not talking about the 1865 actually adopted 13th Amendment, a proposed 13th Amendment in 1861. So judicial rulings constitute another major reason Lincoln claimed he could not interfere with slavery in late 1860 and into early 1861 as Southern lawmakers drafted and passed ordinances to secede from the Union. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a notorious, in my opinion, decision against a one-time enslaved man turned freedman, originally from Virginia, named Dred Scott, who later was enslaved in Missouri. For a while after, he enjoyed legal freedom in Illinois, as well as in the Wisconsin Territory, both of which had banned slavery. But ultimately, he suffered re-enslavement in Missouri. Chief Justice of the United States, not the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, wrote a blistering majority opinion. Not only did the U.S. Constitution not allow unfree people to bring suit in federal court, Taney reasoned, but no white person had to respect a single whim of a non-white person. I contend that this is a ruling that every American citizen in every part of the country and folks abroad should read the entire opinion. But again, that's too a discussion for another day. In 1859, same Supreme Court reinforced its pro-slavery position in a case style Abelman v. Booth. It basically declared that state courts could not invalidate the rulings of federal courts and was an open refutation of personal liberty laws. Because of Scott and Abelman, among others, Lincoln said he had no choice but to recognize citizens' constitutional rights to own human subjects. Great emancipator, but I'll talk about that perhaps later too. Someone might ask a question. Countless white Alabamians liked the general position that Lincoln took on slavery, even though they might not have liked Lincoln himself or the political party he represented, which again was the Republican Party. Quite different from the Republican Party today, by the way. Alabama was a predominantly Democratic state. Lincoln again was a Republican. The views of a prominent Democrat by the name of Jabez L.M. Curry, J.L.M. Curry, whom many individuals probably know better from his serving as president of Howard College in Marion, Alabama, and later leading both the Peabody and the Slater funds. In any event, he wrote a letter on December 21, one day after South Carolina's secession, to an Alabama newspaper in Greensboro called the Beacon. Curry was a native Georgian. He asserted that respectable white Southerners would never submit themselves to the abolitionist dynasty that Republicans such as Lincoln were attempting to establish. Curry then addressed protective tariffs. In his questionable judgment, white Southerners had paid egregious taxes to build up Northern industry and commerce. Abolitionist Northerners, Curry reported, complained of white Southerners being responsible for the continuing of slavery, but they extended its life by making boats and shipping goods to foreign markets, among other activities. Northerners also, Curry added, violated the U.S. Constitution by not adhering to the federal fugitive slave law, and perhaps worst of all, in Curry's estimation, they elected the chief of a rebel section, meaning Lincoln, of course, he said, to lead the South. Apparently, that Lincoln was a Southerner did not matter to Curry. In any event, Curry exclaimed when a number of Southern lawmakers proposed to secede from the Union. Northern officials threatened the Southerners with the sword and the halter. Now, the majority of Curry's white Alabama contemporaries in late 1860 and in early 1861 supported what he wrote to the Beacon. Thousands of Alabamans, however, did not champion breaking the Union to maintain slavery. White objection to secession was heaviest in Northern Alabama. And I'm going to borrow a map from a colleague of mine, Michael Fitzgerald's book. And this map, make sure on the right page, this map actually shows the sort of support for slavery. Northern areas you see was opposed largely. I guess you can't see me, I'm holding up the book. In the central region, the Black Belt in particular, where the not the vast majority, but the majority of enslaved persons survived, was, of course, heavily for secession. And then south of that, in the coastal plains and the wiregrass, it was sort of mixed. In a letter to Alabama Governor and Democrat Andrew B. Moore, whom I've already mentioned, a Unionist or a Southerner who maintained loyalty to the Union from Winston County, a man by the name of Robert Bale, stated that he was more afraid of secession than he was of any political or constitutional reform that Lincoln could propose because the U.S. Congress had to approve the reform.
About 30 seconds.
Before pro-slavery Southern lawmakers left their seats, they could block any piece of legislation someone offered. Bell likewise claimed that Lincoln had been begging for peace since Northern voters primarily elected him president in November 1860. Bale, in a very succinct closing to Moore, said he would support the Confederacy that people such as Curry and Moore eventually would create when Lincoln violated the Confederate Constitution. If I may take 15 seconds. Just 15?
Yes,
just
sir.
15 seconds. All right. So you have all of these statements, right, that individuals made to make clear, that is, the lawmakers make clear. An Alabamian, for example, said that slavery was the rock on which the old government split. His name was Gaba Yelverton. But the supreme statement about the real reason for the seceding of the Southern states and the formation of the Confederacy came in March 1861 by the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, yet another Georgian. He said that the Confederacy has put to rest forever all the agitating questions relating to the peculiar institution, meaning race-based slavery. African slavery as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro, was the immediate cause of the late rupture and the present revolution. Our new government, 3 seconds. The cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. This is our new government. Stevens closed. It was the first in the history of the world, he said, based upon the great physical, philosophical, and moral truth that persons of African ancestry were inferior to those of European ancestry.
Thank you, Dr. English, for helping us understand African American enslavement and secession as a dominant issue leading to the Civil War. We're going to open the floor up now for questions for our guest speakers, and I guess I want to start that off with a couple of questions. I want to go back to you, Dr. Hambury. At the very beginning, and I want you to sort of talk a little bit about. You said that this return to the nation's founding principles, and was it really a return to the nation's founding principles? And did the nation's founding principles, and I think you articulated this to some degree, did it really incorporate the idea of enslavement and the enslavement, as a system that ran parallel to this idea of freedom?
I certainly think so. And I think Dr. English's presentation builds on that as well, did you see this parallel system developing? Yeah, I certainly think so. And what was the other part of your question?
Well, that you addressed it. I do want you to talk a little bit actually about in that the purpose of our conversation to some degree is to look at local issues of slavery and local issues of enslavement in Alabama, and then how that ties to the national issue. And one of the things that you draw or you point to that I would like you to expand on maybe is this idea of the enslaved person as a commodity, particularly these ability to utilize enslaved people for mortgages. Some would argue, I know Edward Baptiste argues in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, that, and there's a number of other books that argue that slavery was essential to this proto-capitalistic development. It helped to, no, I'm going to say help. It was a main force behind the development of capitalism in the United States and worldwide. Do you see the use of enslaved people in terms of using them to leverage property, using them to garner loans as essential in the economic development of this nation?
Certainly, I agree with Baptiste and Sven Beckert in Empire of Cotton, who makes similar arguments. What's interesting about the settlement of the Old Southwest, Alabama, Mississippi, so on and so forth, is that one of the first government institutions that is established are orphans courts, right? Essentially, that's, courts are established almost from the time that settlers are here. And when you start looking at what these courts are dealing with, they're dealing with matters of property, both land and enslaved people, and facilitating commerce. And so, one of the essential questions that I think we often talk about, not just the region, but the country, is it a republic with slaves or a slave republic? And certainly I think that with the examples that I provided on a national level, it's a slave republic. And then when you dive a little deeper and start looking regionally, certainly, cotton may be the product, but I would argue that slavery is the business, and the courts are there to facilitate that business. And the local legal records bear that out.
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, we looked at, in terms of the development of industrialization, we looked at the railroads as the driving forces that multiplying industry. But recent scholars have really pointed to slavery as the driving force. But
certainly.
One of the things Dr. Hambury, I've taken a couple of my classes to the county archives to actually see those papers,
right.
See the documents. I think that's something different and special about being able to touch and see and experience these documents related to the institution of slavery. But we have a question from Debbie Pendleton. She asks, for you to talk a little bit about access to these records, particularly any digitization projects that might be ongoing or you might initiate to make these records more accessible.
That's a great question. So we have a number of efforts. For those of you who are not familiar with Alabama Mosaic, it's a digital archive to which institutions across the state contribute various digitized materials. So to that digital repository, we have added the slaveholders' affidavits as well as Freedmen's Bureau labor contracts that we have. But what I'd like to focus on is the grant that we've recently been awarded from the National Archives. So the Montgomery County Archives, along with the University of Mississippi, Mississippi State University, Delta State University, the Columbus Lowndes Public Library, and Historic Natchez Foundation were awarded $342,000 from the national government to locate, digitize, and make available online antebellum legal records that mention enslaved people. And so we're currently working on that. And the end result will be two products. One will be the inclusion of the records in the Digital Library of Slavery at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and then and inclusion in a digital archive at Mississippi State University. So we are working on a number of fronts. Another project that we started early in my tenure at the Montgomery County Archives is indexing and transcribing estate files and real property records like mortgages that contain references to enslaved people. Now, I use the word indexing loosely. It's essentially, a PDF with the data, but it is available on our website, and it is essentially forming the basis for our participation in that grant project, which I neglected to name. It's called the Lantern Project, and you can find information about that on our Facebook page or simply just Googling it. There's a lot of press releases out there about that digitization project.
Okay. Dr. English, I'd like to address a few things with you, if you don't mind. One is, I just couldn't help but you focused some attention on William Lowndes Yancey. And I guess I'm sort of disappointed that he didn't live to see the end, of the Civil War and the aftermath of what he helped to bring about. But in terms of this issue of the cause of the Civil War, and you focus really on slavery as the preeminent and most critical cause of the Civil War. Is there really, from a historiographical standpoint, is there really continuing debate as to how primary slavery was to the secession and the Civil War?
Yes. It could be. Should it be? No, in my estimation, but does it continue? Yes. And it's not just these sort of fringe elements, neoconservatives, persons who, for example, published works in a certain Louisiana-based press I shall not name. But, even if one, for example, were to look at some recent scholarly articles, and again in some journals I shall not say, but there is this attempt again to make more nuanced the reason for Southern secession and the American Civil War. Even individuals, are sort of bringing back up the idea that you had these sort of differing sort of spiritual beliefs and religious beliefs that were going on in the American South and outside of the American South, primarily in the North and Northeast. But it's very simple when one remembers that Second Great Awakening that swept through the entire country. There were individuals, for example, in the American North who did indeed support slavery. In fact, some of the primary ports, those that were in New York and moving on to Canada, for example, persons were sometimes prone to return individuals to legal-based enslavement below the so-called border states, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and then Kentucky. But oftentimes they did so for a number of reasons, including money, of course. You got more money by way of the federal fugitive slave laws by returning those individuals than not. But that said, still, you have individuals who will continue to suggest, for example, that slavery was an important reason, as you state, but there are yet others, and persons continue to this day to go back to this taxation issue, which is, extremely interesting to me when one remembers that, money bills start in the House of Representatives. Again, Republicans never had a 75% majority during that secession debate. And even if they did, of course, that legislation would then move to the Senate. And again, Democrats, pro-slavery Democrats control that particular branch of government. And somehow if it made it to Buchanan, for example, Buchanan would have vetoed it because he thought protectionism was somewhat communistic and perhaps unconstitutional. Abraham Lincoln, again, his position was clear. Even though he, from time to time, not always, but from time to time, said that race-based slavery or ethnic-based slavery was a monstrosity, a human monstrosity, he still said there was nothing that he could do about it legally. So if I just one more statement before you get me, because I know you're gonna get me, but just let me get one more statement in. And that's we talk about scholarship, but before we even get to scholarship, if ideas were not still, I think, in the academic, the scholarly domain, you wouldn't have, Doc, these textbook publishers, collegiate levels and high school levels in particular, that continue to print, for example, that states' rights, taxation, all of these other ideas were the reason the Southern lawmakers decided to secede, but then not explain why, or the sort of undercurrent of a state's right. A state's right to do what? To have or not to have enslaved individuals serving as property. But more than just that, I contend that race-based slavery, so it might have been the business, whether you say cotton or the enslaved person who was cultivating, growing the cotton and so forth, fantastic. But that still does not account for 75% of white persons in slaveholding territories and states not owning a single enslaved person.
We'll have to end there. Thank you, Dr. English.
Dr. Robinson, can I ask Dr. English a question?
Well, we really are out of time.
I hope you ask a question that allows me to finish my statement. Go ahead.
We're really out of time, and we're gonna have to continue this conversation in another format, in another forum. I'd like to thank our audience for participating in the program and their questions for our discussants. Dr. Franklin, Project Director for the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture, will now bring remarks.
On behalf of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all of you in our audience for your attendance today. We especially want to thank our program participants, Associate Provost Wikesa, Dr. Hambury, Dr. English, Drs. Autry and Robinson for their outstanding presentations. Thanks also to our program organizers, Ms. Destiny Williams and the very dedicated staff of the National Center. May I also thank our president, Dr. Ross, Provost Pettis in the Office of Academic Affairs, and our university administration for making this program possible in partnership with the Trenton branch of ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Thank you for your ongoing contributions to our center and your support of our mission to serve as a research center and repository for the study of civil rights, social justice, and African American culture. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin and the National Center invite you to follow us on Facebook at Civil Rights Center and to visit our webpage for information concerning our upcoming programs, including our Monday, March 15th, Montgomery District County 3 City Council Candidates Forum. We wish you good health, prosperity. Thank you.